In the late evening of June 21st, 1941, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov sat at a desk in the Defense Commissar's office on Frunze Street in Moscow, furiously scribbling telegrams to the principal commanders of the Red Army. It had been a tense day, and the evening was humid and close despite thunder showers a bit earlier. Zhukov, at 45, a solid, heavy-set, rather darkly handsome man, wore the shoulder insignia of a full general in the Red Army. He was now, as he had been for several months, Chief of Staff of the Soviet High Command, number 2 to his friend and longtime associate, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, the People's Commissar of Defense. On that evening of June 21st, Zhukov and Timoshenko were working in Timoshenko's office, personally filling out telegraph blanks. The pile of telegrams grew higher and higher as the clock slowly ticked away, but not until 30 minutes after midnight, 30 minutes into the morning of June 22, 1941, was an orderly summoned to rush the messages to the dispatchers for transmission to all military commands on Russia's western, northern and southern frontiers. Orders to draft the telegrams had been given at a troubled meeting of the Politburo, which Joseph Stalin had hurriedly called in his Kremlin office a few hours earlier to consider mounting evidence that the Nazis were preparing to attack the Soviet Union. The sense of the Politburo meeting had been confused because Stalin still refused to believe that war was about to begin. The Soviet dictator continued to suggest that the real danger was of a provocation, an attack, possibly by individual Nazi generals who wished to create a casus belli, to make an excuse for a war between Russia and Germany. Nor had Stalin been able to erase from his mind a deep, festering suspicion that, by some means or other, that old fox, Winston Churchill, was trying to trick him into war with Germany. The fact that Stalin's military and intelligence chiefs were able to present him with detailed plans, precise data on the hour of the intended German attack, the numbers of divisions emplaced on the western frontiers, the objectives of the main German thrusts, none of this counterbalanced in Stalin's mind a sickly fear that Russia somehow might be provoked into taking action which would make war with Germany inescapable. Not even information brought across the lines by German deserters, warning that the hour of attack had been fixed for 4 a.m., seemed to make an impression on Stalin. The deserters, he thought, could be part of the big trick. What General Zhukov thought of all this, if indeed he was even asked for an opinion at the Kremlin meeting, is not known. Now, as a good soldier, he was writing out telegrams which expressed the essence of Stalin's position. The telegrams warned Russia's commanders of the possibility of a sudden attack from the German side on either June 22nd or 23. They said that the action might begin with a provocation. The Soviet armed forces were ordered to avoid any action that could be interpreted by the Germans as provocation, but at the same time to take up defensive positions, occupy advanced field fortifications, camouflage aircraft, disperse planes to field locations, place all troops on the alert, man anti-aircraft defenses, prepare to black out cities and institute civil defense precautions. All of this was to be done before dawn of June 22nd, and in the greatest secrecy, lest even the carrying out of defense maneuvers be seized upon by the Nazis as an excuse for making war. Long before many of the telegrams could be delivered, the German attack had begun, at 3:30 a.m. Even in those commands where the instructions arrived before the actual start of war, the interlude was far too short to permit the assumption of an effective defense posture. The truth was that one of the great military disasters of our time was in the making on the night of June 21st, 1941, the colossal tactical surprise which Hitler's armies achieved over the Russians. Within hours, the Soviet Air Force would lie burnt, wrecked, destroyed on the ground, its commanders facing the firing squad or cheating the executioner by suicide. The flower of the Red Army would be staggering east, some units decimated, many without arms, others virtually exterminated. Hundreds of thousands of troops would find themselves fatally trapped and encircled, scores or even hundreds of miles behind the spearheads of the advancing Nazi panzers. Within a few weeks, German armies would stand at the gates of Leningrad, Kiev and Moscow, and the fate of the Soviet state would hang in the balance. As the clock ticked away that long spring evening, it brought Stalin and his Russia minute by minute closer to disaster. By the same token, it propelled Zhukov into perhaps the most striking military career of the century. The names of many military men may be better known in the West: England's Montgomery, Germany's Rommel and Guderian, de Gaulle of France, America's Eisenhower, MacArthur and Patton. But when history has completed its painful task of evaluation, when the grain of achievement is sifted from the chaff of notoriety, it seems certain that the name which will stand above all others as the master of the art of mass warfare in the 20th century will be that of this broad-beamed, fierce, determined man who turned the tide of battle against the Nazis, against Hitler, not once, but time after time after time. Not that Zhukov is without his critics, particularly in his own country. The passions, ambitions and rivalries born in the titanic battles of Russia have left deep marks. The struggle of the Soviet armies against the German forces was succeeded by the struggle of the Soviet marshals against each other. These men, powerful, egocentric, domineering, central figures in battles in which they commanded as many men as are to be found in a great metropolitan city, superfigures who held hundreds of thousands of lives at their disposal, seldom see the events of World War II in an even light. You will look in vain in their memoirs for objective or dispassionate accounts of what happened. They are combative, argumentative men carrying on polemics not only with those German generals who have written of the war, but against each other, against Stalin, against Stalin's associates and Stalin's successors. They are quick to blame, slow to acknowledge error. In these polemics, no greater controversies have arisen than those which have swirled around the name of Zhukov, a humble name in Russian, the root of which is zhuk, meaning beetle or cockroach. In the inevitably acrimonious debate over responsibility for the colossal blunders which came so close to giving Hitler victory over Russia, there was a savage search for scapegoats. Stalin, of course, was the man upon whom responsibility rested since, as absolute dictator, the decisions and errors were his. His hated, feared police chiefs and his bumbling cronies, Voroshilov and Budeny, have shared the opprobrium. However, some Soviet critics, particularly those who wanted to protect the sacrosanct figure of Stalin, sought to shift the blame to Zhukov and Timoshenko. These men headed the defense establishment on the eve of war. They should have taken precautions. They should have insisted on Stalin's putting the Red Army on the alert. So ran the indictment. In actual fact, as the record shows, there was not a chance of turning Stalin from his fatal course. Zhukov had been serving as Chief of Staff just 6 months when war broke out. He was named to the post on January 14, 1941, in a manner typical of the way in which Stalin ran his country. Over Christmas and New Year's, the Kremlin had conducted a military conference which wound up with high-level war games based on a postulated German attack. Suddenly, on 2 hours' notice, Stalin summoned his top commanders to the Kremlin and ordered the Chief of Staff, Kirill Meretskov, to deliver a report on the exercise. Flustered and unprepared, Meretskov botched his report. Discussion was supposed to follow. Instead, Stalin curtly intervened. "Comrade Timoshenko has requested that Comrade Zhukov be named Chief of the General Staff. Do you all agree?" There were no objections. Without explanation, Meretskov was out, Zhukov was in. Even at that point, Zhukov was not exactly an unknown, but he was a comparatively junior officer, almost as junior an officer in the Soviet hierarchy as was Dwight D. Eisenhower when General George Marshall jumped him over hundreds of seniors and put him on the path to becoming America's #1 World War II commander. The parallels in the careers of the two men were to strike both of them later, when each found himself his nation's supreme commander at war's end in Berlin. In 1941, Zhukov's career had reached the takeoff point. All his life he had been a professional soldier. In fact, he may descend from a line of Russian professional soldiers dating back to Tatar times. He was born into a poor peasant family in the village of Strelkovka, about 60 miles east of Moscow. But Strelkovka was no ordinary hamlet. The name of the village derives from the Streltsy, the archers of Ivan the Terrible, who set up settlements on the approaches to Moscow to protect the Russian capital against Tatar assault. Zhukov's military life began early. At 12, he had been apprenticed to the fur trade in Moscow, but when World War I broke out, he joined the crack Novgorod Dragoons, winning 2 Orders of St. George, the highest Tsarist military decoration, for bravery before the revolution came, and he signed up for the Red Army in October 1918. Zhukov's career and that of the Soviet regime are practically coterminous. He became a Bolshevik Party member in 1919 and fought against the Whites at Tsaritsyn, where Stalin made the military reputation which his courtiers later were so vastly to inflate. Zhukov was wounded in the Tsaritsyn battles, but not seriously. Here he first came in contact with Timoshenko when his cavalry unit was attached to Timoshenko's 2nd Cavalry Brigade, which in turn was part of Boudeni's famous 1st Cavalry Army. Zhukov had been a non-commissioned officer in the Tsar's army. He rose to squadron commander under Timoshenko. With the end of the Civil War, Zhukov began his education in Red Army schools and was still serving under Timoshenko in the 3rd Cavalry Corps, attached to the Byelorussian military district, when he was detached for study at the Frunze Military Academy in 1928-31. In the early 30s, Zhukov shifted from cavalry to tanks. He had been one of the Red Army officers who had gone to Germany secretly before the rise of Hitler to study with General Hans von Seeckt, and he was one of the officers sent to Spain to observe German, Italian and Russian armoured tactics under battlefield conditions. Later he went to China with the Soviet military mission attached to Chiang Kai-shek and had a look at the techniques of the Japanese Kwantung Army. All of this made excellent preparation for Zhukov's great chance, which was now dramatically taking shape on the night of June 21, 22. The years 1936–38 had been the time of the great Stalin purges. In 1938, the blow fell on the Red Army. Stalin wiped out its leadership cadre, beginning with the Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Tukhachevsky, and continuing through the officer corps. 1/2 or more of the 75,000 officers in the Red Army were liquidated, shot, arrested, or sent to prison or concentration camps. The void had to be filled. The men of Zhukov's generation, those who had survived, found themselves propelled into top positions. In 1938, the Russians and the Japanese had fought a bloody but undeclared war at Lake Khasan on the Manchurian Maritime Province's frontier, about 75 miles southwest of Vladivostok. The engagement ended inconclusively. Then, in 1939, more serious fighting developed along the Manchurian-Mongolian frontier. The trouble started in January with a minor border clash, but steadily grew more intense. By May, major Japanese forces were engaged against combined Soviet-Mongolian units in the vicinity of Khalkhin-Gol, on the eastern approaches to Mongolia. The fighting spread as the Japanese engaged larger and larger units, until by July a small-scale war was in progress, with the Soviets being very hard-pressed. At this point, Georgy Zhukov made his appearance. He took over the Soviet First Army Group and, for the first time, demonstrated what came to be his outstanding military characteristics. Zhukov assumed command in early July. He held a defensive posture against the Japanese for weeks, while carefully and methodically building up his forces until he mustered a 3-2 superiority in manpower, a 2-1 ratio in artillery and planes, and a 4-1 advantage in armour. By the time he was ready to attack, Zhukov had amassed 35 infantry battalions and 20 cavalry squadrons against the 25 infantry battalions and 17 cavalry squadrons of the Japanese Sixth Army. Zhukov also had nearly 500 tanks, 346 armoured cars, and 500 planes. He attacked at 5:45 a.m. on August 20th, 1939. By August 31st, he had driven the Japanese back in disorder across the Mongol-Manchurian frontier. British military historian John Erickson accurately describes the action as a brilliant but costly operation. Zhukov had been lavish in the expenditure of manpower, painstaking in building up a massive superiority. But the payoff was impressive. He drove the Japanese out of Soviet territory with crushing losses. It was a lesson which cut deep. The memory of the terrible Soviet firepower stayed with the Japanese military. This played an important role in discouraging the Japanese High Command from intervening in the Far East during the dangerous days when Russia was so heavily engaged against the Nazis in the West. It may well have played a decisive role in the Japanese decision to sign a non-aggression pact with the Russians just weeks before Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union. Talking with General W. Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff at the end of World War II, Zhukov was modest about his victory over the Japanese. "The Japanese are not good against armor," he said. "It took about 10 days to beat them." As for his expenditure of manpower, his willingness to take human losses, Zhukov offered no excuses. It was part of war. He made his attitude clear in a talk with General Eisenhower. "If we come to a minefield, our infantry attack exactly as if it were not there," he said. "The losses we get from personnel mines we consider only equal to those we would have gotten from machine guns and artillery if the Germans had chosen to defend the area with strong bodies of troops instead of minefields." This was the philosophy of a man determined to attain his military objective. It might cost many human lives, but if the position had to be taken, if the battle had to be won, if the enemy had to be smashed, one must be prepared to pay the price. This was the philosophy that Zhukov carried into World War II. He never fought a battle in which he spared the lives of men. Only through the expenditure of life, he believed, could military goals be achieved. Khalkhin Gol made Zhukov's name one to be reckoned with. He returned from Mongolia to assume the post of deputy commander of the Ukrainian military district, commanded by his old friend and close associate, Marshal Timoshenko. When, in January 1940, Timoshenko was hurriedly ordered to Leningrad to take command of the disastrous winter war against Finland, he naturally took Zhukov along as chief of staff. Once the winter war was won, Stalin conducted an exhaustive post-mortem. While it did not address all the root causes of Soviet military troubles, many of which were related to Stalin's political misjudgments, it did result in a shuffle of Soviet commands. Marshal Timoshenko was moved to the Defense Commissariat, replacing Stalin's inept crony Marshal Voroshilov. This also led to a new distribution of command posts, placing many able young officers in key positions, including Zhukov in Timoshenko's old post at Kiev. Zhukov's assignment to Kiev marked another milestone in his career. It placed him in association with Nikita S. Khrushchev, then the Ukrainian Communist Party chief, a man who later would play a major role in Zhukov's life, as Zhukov would in Khrushchev's. In 1940, both men were relative unknowns, newcomers, younger men, very much on the move. The year 1940 was a curious and unreal year in the Soviet Union. It was the year when Stalin's dream of Hitler becoming bogged down in the West, of Hitler and the Western powers draining each other's strength to Russia's advantage, began to come apart. Hitler, with bold strokes, occupied Denmark and Norway, and crushed France in a classic blitzkrieg. By autumn, he stood at the Channel. London and other English cities burned and crumbled under the bombs of the Luftwaffe. All was quiet in the east, but would it remain so? Stalin showed no sign of concern, although in November he sent Foreign Minister Molotov to Berlin to negotiate with Hitler, a baffling, bullying meeting which probably confirmed Hitler's intention, already virtually fixed, that he must now attack Russia. In the Soviet Union, there was no hint, public or private, of any rift, no warning of danger, no sign that the Nazi-Soviet pact had not guaranteed peace in our time for Stalin and his co-partner Hitler. It was against this background that Zhukov made his first public declaration, a speech which later became quite famous. On December 11, 1940, in Kiev, at a special party military meeting that Khrushchev also attended, Zhukov levelled a strong attack on the traditional Red Army system of political commissars, with all its implications of divided control. The system had been abolished a few months earlier by decree of his friend Timoshenko, but there was still much to be done, Zhukov stressed, if better and traditional military discipline was to be established. He criticised the older officers of the High Command and warned sternly against any tricks of foreign enemies, however they might be disguised. The Red Army, he emphasised, must stand guard on the western frontiers at this moment of international peril. It was clear that the thrust of his remarks was directed at a potential war with Germany, this at a time when Soviet commanders were being reprimanded or even subjected to political repression for any statement suggesting that the Nazi-Soviet pact did not firmly safeguard Soviet security. A few days later, Zhukov, along with other top Soviet army commanders, went to Moscow for military conferences and war games that ultimately led to his appointment once again as chief of staff to his friend Timoshenko. No longer was Zhukov on the periphery. Now he was at the center of the Soviet Defense Organization. It is difficult to imagine that Zhukov was not concerned by what he found when he entered the Defense Commissariat in January 1941. Intelligence reports were flooding in about Germany's preparations for attack. Zhukov was too experienced an officer to be complacent about the state and disposition of Soviet defenses in case Hitler struck. But there was little he or anyone could do so long as Stalin remained convinced that war would not come, or at least not before 1942. The record shows that Zhukov initiated a series of measures that would have put the Red Army in excellent shape to hold off Hitler in 1942. But like the rest of the Red Army command, he was paralyzed in the short term, so long as Stalin insisted that nothing be done to upset Hitler or encourage any factions within Germany who might be looking for an excuse to attack Russia. In fact, acting on direct orders from Stalin, Zhukov angrily countermanded instructions given by General MP Kirponos, his successor in Kiev, who had sought to move his advance units into forward fortifications just before the war began in June 1941. Zhukov also compelled General F.I. Kuznetsov, commander of the Special Baltic Military District, to cancel orders for blackout precautions in Baltic cities. Then, on the night of June 21, 22, events overtook Russia, Stalin, and Zhukov. The outbreak of war threw Russia into chaos. Stalin fell into a nervous collapse from which he did not emerge for some time. It was several weeks before his hand began to be felt again at the throttle of the Soviet machine. Zhukov, along with the communist political leadership, found themselves caught in a whirlwind of confusion. Timoshenko was named to head a new high command, of which Zhukov was appointed chief of staff, and Stalin was relegated to being just an ordinary member. This did not last long. In July, Stalin took over again as the head of a state defense committee, and men like Timoshenko and Zhukov were rushed from one crisis point to another in an endless and seemingly vain effort to halt the onrush of the German panzers. It was at this time that Zhukov began to emerge as the master of disaster, the general who was sent in when all else failed, whose terrible temper, iron will, and savage determination, which wore men down and condemned not a few to the firing squad, somehow succeeded in bringing the German war machine to a grinding halt and setting the stage for a counterblow. Zhukov's name became attached to every great battle of Russia's Western Front. He won the first victory of Russian arms over the Germans in the merciless Battle of Yelnya, 50 miles southeast of Smolensk and 220 miles west of Moscow, in the last days of August and early September 1941. The great battles fought by Zhukov included the Battle of Moscow, October 1941, January 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad, August 1942, February 1943, the Battle of Kursk-Orel, spring-summer 1943, and the Battle of Berlin, spring 1945. Each of these engagements had its own characteristics, but each followed the Zhukov pattern. Each time he directed enormous masses of troops, sometimes as many as 20 armies or more. Each engagement involved upwards of 1 million men on each side. Each was marked by enormous casualties. Each was characterized by extremely careful staff work, lavish expenditure of artillery, maximum use of armor, and the deployment of masses of infantry. Each inflicted on the Germans casualties that left a lasting mark, not only on the army, but on the nation itself. There was nothing nice, gentle, or refined about Zhukov's tactics. There are no warm passages in the memoirs of Russian military figures about kind deeds, thoughtful encouragement, or friendly comfort from Zhukov. But there are story after story of his terrible threats. Fulfill the order or face the firing squad, obey or die. Zhukov's style was simple. No one who had to deal with him was ever in doubt of the consequences of failure. "Carry out the order by morning, or you will be shot for treason in the palace square." This was Zhukov's warning to one commander. He indicted another general for passive resistance when the officer refused to carry out an order. Zhukov was not the man's commander. A favourite Zhukov tactic was to issue a sharp and often impossible order by telephone and hang up before the commander could offer any argument or comment. Marshal Konstantin K. Rokossovsky, who served with Zhukov from the early 1920s, knew him as well as any Soviet military figure and deeply respected him. After the war, Rokossovsky characterized Zhukov in these terms. "Zhukov was always a man of strong will and decisiveness, brilliant and gifted, demanding, firm and purposeful. All these qualities, unquestionably, are necessary in a great military leader, and they were inherent in Zhukov. It is true that sometimes his toughness exceeded what was permissible. For example, in the heat of the fighting around Moscow, Zhukov sometimes displayed unjustified sharpness. As the war went on, Zhukov acquired enormous authority. He was hailed as a national hero for his victory in the Battle of Moscow, sharing the tributes with his close wartime associate, Marshal Rokossovsky. Zhukov was known as the Spasitel, the saviour of Moscow. During this period, he had Stalin's confidence and may even have acquired a certain domination over the dictator. However, as is evident from his battle histories, this did not necessarily mean that he was able to get his way in tactics or strategy. Zhukov's way of fighting a battle, perhaps as much dictated by necessity as by design, was to let the enemy extend themselves, wait until the last moment of the German offensive momentum, and then grind the Nazis down in terrible, bloody exchanges as they neared their objective. Meanwhile, despite fearful Russian losses and the dangerous German penetration, Zhukov cautiously and carefully massed reserve armies, which he refused to commit to action, no matter the peril at the front. Then, at the moment when the German strength was spent, he would unleash his counterblow with dramatic rapidity, often within 48 hours of a German pause, and before the Nazis could establish a reliable defence. Zhukov hurled his reserve forces on the German flanks, striking for envelopment or a pincers movement. It did not always work. He attempted an envelopment in his first major battle, the Yelnya engagement. The Germans managed to escape entrapment by a whisker. He repeated the tactic in each subsequent battle. Zhukov was familiar with the military classics, from Caesar to Clausewitz. He was a literate, even cultured man, but he deliberately presented himself as rude, profane, abusive, and domineering. The engagements in which Zhukov won his reputation were so massive that many outstanding Soviet military men were involved, either under Zhukov's command or in coordinated and associated movements. Deep political cleavages and quarrels underlay the military disputes. Not only military glory was at stake, political intrigue, intra-party quarrels, and high-level Kremlin politics played a role. Zhukov's principal military rivals included fellow marshals such as Ivan S. Konev, Rodion Malinovsky, Sykes-Chuikov, A.I. Yeremenko, Semyon Timoshenko, and, to a lesser extent, figures like K.K. Rokossovsky, V.D. Sokolovsky, and staff chiefs like A.M. Vasilevsky, Boris Shaposhnikov, and later S.M. Shtermenko. Rivals of a different category included Stalin's cronies, men like Voroshilov and Budeny, and police generals such as L.Z. Meklis and G.I. Kulik. Yet, at the end of the war, Zhukov's prestige was so enormous that he shared the podium with Stalin at the Great Moscow Victory Parade in June 1945 and entertained his fellow commander and friend, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The two men were not merely military associates, they were genuine friends. Both were popular figures, heroes in their countries, non-political men with a rather simplistic view of life. Eisenhower came to Moscow as Zhukov's guest and invited Zhukov to visit the United States. Zhukov accepted. To many, it seemed that Zhukov's prestige was such that he might well be Stalin's first minister and probable successor. It appeared that, in any event, the influence of Zhukov and other great Soviet generals would dominate post-war Soviet political life. Acting on this assumption, the United States hastened to send Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General W. Bedell Smith, to Moscow as ambassador. He was almost as good a friend of Zhukov's as Eisenhower. The calculations, however, failed. They did not take into account Stalin and the nature of Kremlin politics. Zhukov never had a chance to make his visit to the US as Ike's guest. Indeed, he never even met his old friend, Ambassador Smith, in Moscow. Before Smith could take up his post, Zhukov had vanished from the scene. A year or two later, he was found in Odessa, carrying out his duties as commander of the Odessa military district. Stalin was taking no chances on Zhukov becoming a Red Napoleon. Eisenhower might become president, but Zhukov would never have a chance at the general secretaryship of the Communist Party. Whatever their rivalries and disagreements, Stalin's associates in the Politburo shared his views. They feared military candidates upsetting the already intricate and murderous rivalry for succession. It was years before Zhukov re-emerged in the public eye, only after Stalin's death. A year before Stalin's death, Zhukov was permitted to attend a meeting of the Warsaw Pact Powers, but it was not until Stalin was gone that Zhukov reappeared. When he did, he came on fast. He stood in the honor guard at Stalin's bier alongside the surviving Politburo members and became Deputy Minister of Defense in the first post-Stalin government. Then came a dramatic event. On June 30th, 1953, the other members of the Soviet government arrested Lavrenti P. Beria, the head of the secret police, and all of his top aides. It was Zhukov who provided the military forces that enabled the Soviet civilian leadership to swiftly act against the powerful police apparatus. He even publicly urged his colleagues at the November 1953 holiday reception to act against Beria, who had not yet been put on trial. Zhukov offered a toast to justice in the presence of leading foreign ambassadors. The Politburo acted soon afterward. Beria and his aides were put on trial and shot. Justice was done. With the rise of Nikita Khrushchev, Zhukov became Minister of Defense. He took the salute on May Day and November 7th in Red Square and spoke for the government on national defense. The relationship between Khrushchev and Zhukov, first established in pre-war Kiev in 1940, grew closer. In June 1957, Khrushchev's colleagues in the Politburo joined in a plot to oust him. Khrushchev fought back and won with the aid of Zhukov, who put Air Force planes at his disposal to fly members of the party Central Committee to Moscow. Their support gave Khrushchev victory over the combined forces of Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov, Nikolai Bulganin, and a majority of the Politburo. Zhukov now emerged as the strongman of the Khrushchev regime. It began to seem that Stalin and his associates had been right to fear that Zhukov might take political leadership in Russia. Zhukov's role in the arrest and ouster of Beria and in keeping Khrushchev in power showed that he did indeed possess political power, greater than that of Khrushchev. Khrushchev got the message. If he had kept his job only through Zhukov's aid, the day might come when Zhukov decided to oust him, and Zhukov had the power to do it. Khrushchev acted at the first opportunity. In October 1957, when Zhukov visited Albania, Khrushchev set the stage. When Zhukov returned to Moscow, he was put under guard and, within hours, out of a job. For 7 years, Zhukov endured rustication again. He lived in a pleasant villa outside Moscow, puttered with his memoirs and fished. His enemies, both political and military, had a field day. A flood of Soviet histories omitted his role in key battles like Moscow, Stalingrad, or Berlin. History in Russia seemed written in loose-leaf books. Pages could be extracted and replaced at will. Zhukov, who had been a hero during the war, became an unperson after its end. He re-emerged as a hero after Stalin's death, but vanished from print in 1957. With Khrushchev's fall, he came back into the public eye once again. He began to tell his own story, his own version of the great battles on which his reputation rested. In the telling, he repaid some old scores, answered some of his critics, and laid the groundwork for new fireworks with the revelation of conversations with Stalin, arguments over strategy, and errors made by Stalin and other members of the Soviet High Command. He challenged the German generals and many of the Soviet military historians. Whatever else may be said of Zhukov, he was not leaving the world stage without one more dogged, determined, Zhukov-like effort to put the record straight, to tell what really happened behind the scenes in the Kremlin and on the battlefield during the terrible days when the fate of Russia and Germany hung in the balance. The memoir that Zhukov wrote was, inevitably, not only a personal but a political document. He set forth his own position, sought to answer critics, and undercut his military and governmental rivals. At the same time, the memoir had to pass the censorship of the Soviet government. It was exhaustively reviewed by the political administration of the Soviet armed forces, which was not necessarily sympathetic to Zhukov. There were excisions, suppressions, additions, and changes to what Zhukov originally wrote. The chapters on his great battles appeared at different times, in different publications, and under varying conditions of censorship, with varying emphases in the party propaganda line. The first of the Zhukov battle accounts to be published was an account of the Battle of Berlin. It was published in June 1965 in the technical Soviet military organ Voyenno-Historicheski Journal, and was specifically designed as a reply to devastating attacks on Zhukov that had been published under the Khrushchev regime and were probably inspired by Khrushchev himself. A year later, Zhukov published in the same journal a detailed account of the Battle of Moscow. He then supplemented this account in chapters included in collections of essays by commanders who participated in the Moscow fighting, published a year later. In 1967, Zhukov published his version of the Battle of Kursk-Orel, the greatest tank engagement ever fought, and probably the bloodiest single engagement on Russia's Western Front. Some Soviet and foreign critics believe the battle was somewhat mismanaged on both the German and Soviet sides. Finally, in 1968, Zhukov published a lengthy exposition of his role in the Battle of Stalingrad, in a volume on Stalingrad edited by the excellent Soviet military historian A.M. Samsonov. Here, Zhukov established for the first time publicly his dominant role in the strategic and tactical conception of the great Soviet offensive that closed the Iron Circle around von Paulus and some 600,000 Nazi troops. Comparison of the Zhukov accounts reveals discrepancies, changes, omissions, and inclusions that reflect not the Marshal's views, but the imposition of higher Communist Party censorship. A number of these have been noted in the commentary on the present text. Marshal Zhukov's accounts of the 4 final battles of World War II, in which he played a leading role, comprise about half the contents of his complete memoir, which has appeared in the Soviet Union and is scheduled for publication in the West sometime in 1970. Harrison E. Salisbury, New York, April 1969. Editor's note: the story of the first weeks of war in Russia, from Hitler's attack on June 22nd to August, is one of unrelieved horror. Everywhere the Nazis swept forward. Everywhere the Red Army fell back. In some places it was a rout, in others a more orderly retreat. But everywhere the air was filled with tragedy, menace, and apprehension. Stalin gradually regained control of himself during July, and with his return to leadership, there were major changes at Supreme Headquarters. He sent Zhukov to the front on special missions. Timoshenko went too, taking command of the Western Front. After the utter disaster in September, where Marshal Boudeny lost Kiev, probably due to Stalin's stubborn orders to hang on, Timoshenko was put in charge of the collapsing Southwest Front. On July 30th, Zhukov was named commander of the so-called Reserve Front. The Reserve Front was a peculiar feature of Soviet military tactics, set up some distance behind the active front. The idea was that if the actual front collapsed, the Reserve Front would be in position to halt the German advance. If the Nazis were held up at the regular front, the Reserve Army could swing up and deliver a crushing counterblow. The Reserve Front, which Zhukov took over, was established about 100 miles east of Smolensk in the Rzhev-Vyazma area. Smolensk was key to the western approaches to Moscow. If Smolensk fell, it would be Zhukov's task to halt the German panzers on the direct highway to Moscow. There had been fierce fighting there since mid-July. Zhukov had 6 armies under his command on the reserve front. He did not wait in a static defence. He pushed forward and, in early August, went into action near Yelnya. Heavy, grinding fighting, typical of Zhukov's style, ensued. It went on for 26 days. The Germans were brought to a halt. Yelnya returned to Soviet hands, and the Nazi advance on the Central Front was temporarily bogged down. The battle ended on September 5th, and on September 10th, Stalin ordered the front to go on the defensive. Zhukov's success at Yelnya, shared with Rokossovsky and Rokossovsky's 16th Army, was the only bright spot in the picture. The terrible Kiev encirclement was closing. Northward, the Germans seemed about to capture Leningrad. The most tense moment of the war was at hand. Zhukov probably preferred to continue his westward drive at Yelnya, but instead he was summoned to the Kremlin and dispatched on September 12th to Leningrad, now encircled by the Germans. Stalin had come to believe that his old Civil War associate, Marshal Voroshilov, and Party Secretary Zhdanov were either about to deliver Leningrad to the Nazis or were so incompetent that the Germans would capture the northern capital. Zhukov flew off to Leningrad in a towering rage. Upon arrival at Smolny Institute, he hardly spoke to the shattered Marshal Voroshilov. He called Moscow on the high-security telephone and gave Stalin a message. He had taken charge and would pursue operations less lethargically than his predecessor. Voroshilov, broken, left Leningrad thinking he might face the firing squad. Fortunately for him, he did not. Zhukov plunged into his task with savagery. He ousted commanders left and right. He ordered officers and troops not to retreat a step further. Retreaters would face the firing squad. His anger and ferocity caused the toughest generals to pale. But he halted the Germans. He arrived at Leningrad at the high tide of the German attack. The Germans had less than a week before they would begin shifting their heavy armour and crack units southward for the assault on Moscow. While Zhukov brought the Germans to a halt at Leningrad, a situation of incredible danger was opening up on the Moscow front. The German drive for Moscow began on September 30th on the so-called Bryansk front, about 150 miles southwest of Moscow. This front was commanded by General A.I. Yeremenko. The Germans struck at the link between Yeremenko's troops and those of the Western Front, commanded by General Ivan S. Konev. Konev had Nikolai Bulganin, the future defense minister and premier, as his military council member and the brilliant General Vasily D. Sokolovsky as his chief of staff, probably the best command group in the Soviet army. On October 2nd, the Nazi offensive widened to include all three fronts west of Moscow: the Western, the Reserve, now commanded by Marshal Budeny, and the Bryansk. The Russians had 12 armies in the front lines, with 4 in reserve. They had concentrated about 40% of their troops and artillery and 35% of their tanks and planes to meet the expected offensive. But once again, as Zhukov sharply notes, the high command and field commanders were caught off guard. Their attention had been directed to a Nazi breakthrough in the Orel sector, which brought that city into German hands. German armour was heading for Tula, the ancient Russian arms centre, just 65 miles south of Moscow. On the night of October 4th-5, the situation was possibly the most alarming of the war. Moscow lost contact with the Western Front and had no definite information on the situation. At 9 a.m. on October 5th, word was received that the Germans had broken through between the hinge of the 43rd and 24th Armies, just south of Yelnya and east of Roslavl, and were moving east on the Warsaw Highway toward Moscow. This report was initially dismissed as panic. However, reconnaissance flights confirmed the threat, and the Nazis were indeed closer to Moscow than anyone had believed. The Moscow front was falling apart. It was at this moment that Stalin telephoned Zhukov on October 6th and ordered him to Moscow to see what could be done to save the capital. Zhukov arrived in Moscow on October 7th. On October 10th, he was named commander of the Western Front, responsible for all the defences west of the Soviet capital. Konev and Yeremenko were subordinated to him. The battle for Moscow, on which the fate of Russia depended, had begun. Most of the strength of the Nazi forces was concentrated on the Western Front. Nazi Army Group Center, as we now know, had more than 1 million men, 1,700 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 19,000 guns and mortars. It was supported by the powerful Second Air Fleet under Field Marshal Kesselring. By Hitler's directive of September 16th, Army Group Center was tasked with breaking through Soviet defences, surrounding and destroying the main forces of the Western, Reserve and Bryansk fronts, and then, pursuing the remaining Soviet forces, seizing Moscow by enveloping it from both the north and south. By the end of September, Soviet intelligence reported that the enemy was preparing a major offensive against Moscow. The Supreme Command issued warnings to front commanders and ordered them to prepare a firm defence. The general plan was to inflict the heaviest possible losses on the enemy and prevent any breakthrough. To defend the city, vast fortifications were constructed on both the immediate and distant approaches to Moscow. Workers in Moscow and surrounding provinces, including Kaluga, Tula and Kalinin, worked day and night to construct fortifications in the city's streets and on its outskirts. Army engineers prepared minefields and installed various obstacles. Moscow's air defences were fortified with particular care. Voluntary teams were formed by the Moscow City Committee of the Communist Party to train in air defence and first aid. A strict blackout was imposed, and key military objectives, along with many other buildings, were camouflaged. 12 divisions of People's Volunteers had already been stationed on the approaches to the city, with 5 more divisions completing their training. The Moscow Party organization placed all its efforts under the goal of defending the city, effectively transforming Moscow and its environs into a fortified camp. The enemy began his offensive against the Bryansk front on September 30th and against the Western and Reserve fronts on October 2nd. The heaviest attacks occurred north of Dukovshchina and east of Roslavl, targeting the 30th and 19th Armies of the Western Front and the 43rd Army of the Bryansk Front. The German forces succeeded in breaking through Soviet defences. The enemy's shock groups raced ahead, enveloping the entire Vyazma grouping of the Western and Reserve fronts from both the north and south. The situation on the Bryansk front was similarly dire, as the 3rd and 13th Armies were threatened with encirclement. Part of Guderian's army advanced toward Orel, which had been left unguarded. Orel fell on October 3rd. The Bryansk front collapsed, with its forces retreating toward the east and southeast, creating a threatening situation for Tula. On orders from Western Front Commander General Konev, an operational group under Lieutenant General IV Boldin counterattacked the advancing northern enemy forces, but the counterattack was unsuccessful. By October 6th, much of the Western Front's forces, including parts of the 19th Army, 16th Army, 20th Army, and Boldin's operational group, along with the Reserve Front's 32nd and 24th Armies, had been surrounded west of Vyazma. The situation became even more critical as the enemy threatened to break through along the Minsk-Moscow highway toward Mozhaisk and along the Warsaw highway toward Maloyaroslavets. At that time, fortifications along the Mozhaisk defence line and the immediate approaches to Moscow had not yet been completed, and the line was unmanned. Moscow faced the real possibility of a breakthrough. The State Defence Committee, the party's Central Committee and the Supreme Command took immediate measures to halt the enemy advance. Troops were rapidly moved to the defence lines, especially the Mozhaisk line. These movements began on October 7th, with 14 rifle divisions, 16 tank brigades, more than 40 artillery regiments, and other units transferred from the Supreme Headquarters Reserve and neighbouring fronts. However, these forces were clearly inadequate for a reliable defence, as troop transfers from the Far East and other distant areas had been delayed. On the evening of October 6th, I received a telephone call from Joseph Stalin, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. He inquired about the situation near Leningrad, and I reported that the enemy had ceased their attacks. According to prisoners, the German forces near Leningrad had suffered heavy losses and were taking up defensive positions. We had observed an important movement of motorized and tank columns southward from Leningrad, likely towards Moscow. Stalin listened quietly, then said the situation around Moscow was critical, especially on the Western Front. Appoint Chief of Staff General Kozin as acting commander of the Leningrad Front and take a plane to Moscow, he ordered. I passed the orders along to MS Kozin, said my goodbyes to the military council, and flew to Moscow. Our plane landed at the central airport at dusk on October 7th, and I went directly to the Kremlin. Stalin, who was suffering from a case of influenza, greeted me with a nod, pointing to a map. He said, "Look, we're in really serious trouble on the Western Front, yet I can't seem to get a detailed report about what's going on." He instructed me to go immediately to front headquarters, study the situation thoroughly, and call him during the night with updates. At the office of the Chief of the General Staff, Marshal Boris M. Shaposhnikov, who appeared exhausted, briefed me. Stalin had already contacted him and ordered a map of the western sectors. We waited for the map to arrive while Shaposhnikov ordered tea and explained that construction of defence lines along the Mozhaisk area and closer to Moscow was still ongoing, and there were almost no troops in the area. When the map arrived, I set off for Western Front headquarters. On the way, I studied the situation using a flashlight to examine the map. To stay awake, I had the car stopped and jogged for a few hundred yards. I reached front headquarters late that night. General Konev, Bulganin, and General Sokolovsky were meeting with Lieutenant General G.K. Malandin, the front's operations chief, in a dark room lit by a few candles. They were clearly fatigued. I informed them I had been sent by the Supreme Commander to study the situation and report back to him. Bulganin mentioned that he had just spoken to Stalin but had nothing specific to report, as they didn't know the situation of the troops encircled west of Vyazma. General Malandin provided additional details. The enemy, having regrouped on the Moscow approaches, had amassed forces that exceeded those of the Western, Reserve and Bryansk fronts by 40% in infantry, 120% in tanks, 90% in guns and mortars, and 160% in planes. Our defences had been unable to withstand the concentrated attacks. By October 7th, there was no longer a continuous front in the west, and large gaps had formed, which could not be closed due to the lack of reserves. The intelligence gathered by Soviet forces in late September had warned of enemy concentrations near Moscow, indicating that a major offensive was imminent. Yet, despite sufficient manpower and arms to repel the enemy, our forces had failed to properly assess the situation and concentrate forces where needed. The result was that the enemy's concentrated blows overwhelmed our defences. I telephoned Stalin at 2:30 a.m. and reported the critical situation. "The principal danger now is that the road to Moscow is almost entirely unprotected," I said. "The fortifications along the Mozhaisk line are too weak to stop the enemy's armour. We need to concentrate forces on the Mozhaisk defence line as soon as possible." Stalin asked about the positions of various Soviet armies and operational groups. I told him they were encircled west and northwest of Vyazma. He then asked, "What do you plan to do?" I explained I was about to visit Marshal Boudeny, the commander of the Reserve Front. Stalin gave his approval and told me to call him once I arrived at Maloyaroslavets. It was drizzling and dense fog covered the ground. Visibility was poor, but at dawn on October 8th I continued my journey, knowing the fate of Moscow hung in the balance. It was drizzling. A dense fog hugged the ground, and visibility was poor. At dawn on October 8th, as we were approaching the railroad station of Obninskoye, about 70 miles from Moscow, we saw two signalmen laying a cable over a bridge across the Protva River. When asked where the cable was going, they replied curtly, "Where it's supposed to go, that's where," said one of them, a huge soldier who seemed to be suffering from a head cold. The soldiers evidently knew their business and had no intention of giving information to unknown persons. I identified myself and said I was looking for the headquarters of the Reserve Front and Marshal Boudeny. The big signalman said we had passed it and must return to the forest on a hill to the left of the bridge and then inquire for further directions. 10 minutes later, I was in the office of Army Commissar First Rank L.Z. Meklis, together with General Anisov, the front's chief of staff. Meklis was berating someone over the telephone. When he had finished, I announced the purpose of my visit. I explained that I had come as a member of Supreme Headquarters on orders of Stalin to study the situation. I asked where the front commander was. Budeni had visited the 43rd Army the previous day, but his present whereabouts were unknown. Headquarters was worried that something might have happened to him, and signal officers sent in search of him had not yet returned. Neither Meklis nor Anisov could tell me anything specific about the position of either the reserve front troops or the enemy. "You can see the situation we're in," Meklis said. "I am now rounding up the troops who retreated in disorder. We plan to rearm them at collection points and form new units." I had no choice but to try to drive on toward Yukhnov through Maloyaroslavets and Medin, in the hope of clarifying the situation as soon as possible. As we crossed the Protva and passed through Obninskoye, I couldn't help remembering my childhood and youth. It was from this railroad station that my mother had sent me to Moscow as a furrier's apprentice at the age of 12. 4 years later, as a master furrier, I had often visited my parents in their village. I knew the whole area around Maloyaroslavets, having tramped through it in my early years. Just 6 miles from Obninskoye, which was now the headquarters of the reserve front, was the village of Strelkovka in Ugodsky Zavod district, where I was born and where I spent my childhood. My mother and my sister, with her 4 children, now lived there. I was concerned about what might happen to them if the Nazis came. Suppose they learned that these were Zhukov's mother, sister, and nephews. And then— 3 days later, I saw to it that an adjutant moved them from the village to my Moscow apartment. The village and the entire Ugodsky Zavod district were seized by the Germans in October 1941. But the people of my district did not sit idly by. They organized a guerrilla group headed by a courageous fighter, Mikhail Alexeyevich Guryanov, chairman of the Ugodsky Zavod district government. The guerrillas boldly raided German headquarters, rear echelons, and small units of the German forces. One of these night raids destroyed the large rear headquarters of a German corps, and many Nazi officers lost their lives. Unfortunately, Guryanov, the guerrilla commander and a member of the party, was informed upon in November 1941. He was seized, tortured, and hanged by the Germans. To this day, the people of my district tend the grave of this hero who died for his country. A monument has been erected on the grave. When the enemy withdrew from Strelkovka, the entire village, including my mother's home, went up in flames. When we reached Maloyaroslavets, there was not a soul in the streets. The town seemed deserted, but 2 light-tracked vehicles were parked in front of the town hall, a driver asleep in one of them. When he was awakened, the driver told us that this was Budeni's command car. Budeni had arrived at the town hall 3 hours before. I found Budeni inside, and we greeted each other warmly. It was obvious that he had lived through a great deal in those tragic days. When I told him about my visit to Western Front headquarters, Budeni said he had been out of touch with Konev for the last 2 days. While he was visiting the 43rd Army, his own headquarters had moved, and he did not know where it was. I told him that it was beyond the railroad bridge across the Protva River, 70 miles from Moscow, and that they were looking for him. I also told him that the situation was very bad, and that most of the forces of the Western Front had been encircled. "Things are no better here," he replied. "The 24th and 32nd Armies have been cut off, and we have no defence front any more. Yesterday I almost fell into enemy hands between Yukhnov and Vyazma. Large motorized and tank columns were moving toward Vyazma, evidently to bypass the town on the east." "Who is now holding Yukhnov?" "I don't know. We have a small detachment on the Ugra River, 2 infantry regiments but no artillery. I think the enemy has Yukhnov." "Then who is covering the road from Yukhnov to Maloyaroslavets?" "When I came through there, I saw only 3 policemen at Medin," Budeni said. "We agreed that he would go to his headquarters and telephone a report on the situation to Moscow. I would drive toward Yukhnov and then to Kaluga. West of Maloyaroslavets, I met the commander of the local fortified area, Colonel Smirnov, who reported on the progress of fortification work, the availability of worker battalions, and the equipment of the military units capable of defending the approaches to Maloyaroslavets. After I had instructed him to organize reconnaissance and to get his fortified area into fighting shape, I drove on to Medin, I found no one there except an old woman who was rummaging around a house that had been hit by a bomb. "Granny, what are you doing here?" I asked. She stood there with wide-open, wandering eyes and dishevelled grey hair and said nothing. "What's the matter, Granny?" Without replying, the woman went back to digging. Another woman, half-dressed and carrying a half-filled sack, appeared from the ruins. "Don't bother asking her," she said. "She won't say anything. She has lost her mind with grief." She told me that 2 days before, German planes had bombed and strafed the town. Many people had been killed. The residents were getting ready to leave for Maloyaroslavets. The old woman had lived in this house with a little grandson and granddaughter. She was at the well getting water when the raid began. She saw a bomb hit her house. Somewhere under the ruins were the bodies of her grandchildren. The second woman had to hurry. Her home had also been destroyed, and she could not find her shoes and clothes in the rubble. Tears rolled down her cheeks. When asked whether any of our troops had passed through the town, she said that during the night several trucks had driven through toward Maloyaroslavets, followed by horse-drawn carts bearing the wounded. There had been nothing since then. I said goodbye and drove on toward Zhukov, deeply regretting that there was nothing I could say to console this woman or any of the other Soviet people to whom the war had brought such terrible grief. Soon after we had left Medin, we were stopped in a forest by armed Red Army men in tank outfits. One of them told us that we could drive no farther and asked whose car it was. I identified myself and asked in turn where his headquarters was. It turned out to be a tank brigade headquarters 100 yards away in the woods. I was glad to hear this and asked him to lead me there. In the woods, a tank officer of medium height and smart bearing, dressed in blue overalls with goggles over his helmet, rose from the tree stump on which he had been sitting. He looked familiar. "Colonel Troitsky, commander of the Tank Brigade of the Supreme Headquarters Reserve," he said, saluting. So that's who it was. I knew Tu Troitsky well from Khalkhin Gol. In 1939 he served as Chief of Staff of the 11th Tank Brigade. That was the brigade, under the command of hero of the Soviet Union Yakovlev, that defeated the 23rd Infantry Division of the Japanese Imperial Guard near the hill Bain-Sagan. After a hurried greeting, we got down to business. Colonel Troitsky reported that the enemy was holding Zhukov. German advance units had seized the bridge across the Ugra River. A reconnaissance unit sent by Troitsky toward Kaluga had found no Germans in the city, but reported heavy fighting not far from Kaluga, with the 5th Guards Rifle Division and remaining elements of the 43rd Army engaged in the action. Although Troitsky's own brigade was part of the Supreme Headquarters Reserve, it had waited at this point for 2 days without instructions from anyone. I instructed Troitsky to send signal officers to Reserve Front Headquarters near Obninskoye Station to inform Marshal Boudeni about the situation. Part of the brigade was to occupy the terrain forward from Zhukov to the Ugra River, to cut off the enemy's approach to Kaluga, and try to slow the German advance. Directive from Supreme Headquarters, formation of the Western Front. A directive from Supreme Headquarters incorporated all military units and institutions of the Moscow Reserve Front into the newly formed Western Front, effective 11 p.m. on October 12th. In the meantime, the military situation had become increasingly serious. The following report, made on October 12th by the Front's Military Council to Supreme Headquarters, reflects this growing threat. The enemy, with 2 tank divisions, 1 motorized division, and at least 3 infantry divisions, has seized Sikevka and Zubtsov and is continuing to advance toward Kalinin. The advanced units of one of the tank divisions moving toward Kalinin reached a point 15 miles southeast of Staritsa at 9:35 a.m. on October 12th. The following orders have been issued. 1. The commanders of the 22nd and 29th Armies are to rush 1 regiment each, with anti-tank guns on trucks, to the area east of Staritsa to cover the approaches to Kalinin. 2. The 174th Rifle Division, which was on the approaches to Reshaped, is being shifted to Staritsa. 3. The commander of the 22nd Army has been instructed to remove the 256th Rifle Division from the front and send it by forced march to Kalinin for the defense of the city from the south. 4. The commander of the Kalinin garrison has been ordered to position detachments along the Boriskovo-Pokrovskoye line. The defense of Kalinin can only be ensured by the prompt dispatch of at least one rifle division and a tank brigade, neither of which can be spared by the front. I request your authorization for the prompt dispatch of the division to Kalinin from the reserves of the Supreme Command. The approaches to Volokolamsk, which are completely undefended, are in the same situation, and this front can spare no forces for that sector. At least one division should also be urgently dispatched to that area. By mid-October, the newly formed 16th, 5th, 43rd and 49th Armies had a total strength of only 90,000 men. These forces were far from adequate to man a continuous defence line. Therefore, we decided to concentrate them in the principal sectors: Volokolamsk, Istra, Mozhaisk, Maloyaroslavets, and the Podolsk-Kaluga sector. Most of the artillery and anti-tank forces were also concentrated in these areas. On October 13th, the Volokolamsk approaches were entrusted to the 16th Army, headed by General Konstantin K. Rokossovsky. This army included the forces of the Volokolamsk fortified zone and newly arrived units. The 5th Army, under General Govorov, included the forces of the Mozhaisk fortified zone, Colonel Polosukin's 32nd Rifle Division, and newly arrived units. The 43rd Army was commanded by Major General K.D. Golubev and included the forces of the Maloyaroslavets fortified zone. The 49th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General I.G. Zakharkin, included the Kaluga fortified zone. All of these generals were experienced commanders who could be expected to do everything possible with the forces entrusted to them to keep the enemy away from Moscow. I also want to mention the efficient work of the staff of the front under General Sokolovsky, now a marshal, and the energy with which Major General N.D. Psurtsev, the front's chief of signal troops, now Minister of Communications, ensured stable communications among all the parts of the front. Extensive engineering work was underway behind the first echelon of the Western Front to ensure a defence in depth and to install anti-tank barriers in all sectors potentially open to tank attacks. The principal sectors were also backed up by reserves. The front headquarters was moved from Alabino to Perkushkovo, which was linked by telephone and telegraph with all ground and air units. The headquarters was also connected by direct wire with the General Staff and Supreme Headquarters. Flows of supplies were hurriedly organised, together with medical facilities and other rear services. The Communist Party began to explain the gravity of the situation and the immediacy of the threat to Moscow to the Soviet people. The Central Committee called on all citizens to wage a determined struggle against apathy and panic, urging them to fulfill their duty to their homeland by barring the enemy from the capital. The most important thing for us in mid-October was to win time to prepare our defence. The operations of parts of the 19th, 16th, 20th, 24th and 32nd Armies and the Boldin Group encircled west of Vyazma must be credited for their heroic struggle. Although they were cut off in the enemy's rear, they did not surrender. They continued to fight valiantly, attempting to break through to rejoin the main force of the Red Army, thus holding down large enemy formations that would otherwise have pursued the drive toward Moscow. The Front Command and Supreme Headquarters assisted the surrounded troops by bombing German units and with aerial drops of food and ammunition. However, shortages of manpower and arms made it impossible to do more for the encircled forces at that time. Twice, on October 10th and 12th, we dispatched coded radio messages to the commanders of the surrounded troops, containing information about the enemy and ordering a breakout under the overall command of General M.F. Lukin, commander of the 19th Army. However, there was no reply to our messages, likely because they arrived too late. Overall control of the surrounded armies was evidently lost, and troops succeeded in breaking out only in small groups. Nevertheless, the persistent and stubborn fight put up by the encircled forces near Vyazma held down the enemy's main units during the most critical days, winning precious time to organize our defenses along the Mozhaisk line. The sacrifice of the surrounded forces was not in vain. a full account of their heroic struggle, representing such a great contribution to the defence of the capital, still remains to be written. Evacuations and further strategic adjustments. On October 13th, our forces abandoned Kaluga under enemy pressure. Heavy fighting broke out on all sectors that day as the enemy launched large mobile forces in the direction of Moscow. According to front intelligence on October 15th, 50 tanks were in action in the area of Turginovo, 100 at Lotoshino, 100 at Makarovo and Karagatovo, 50 at Borovsk, and 40 at Borodino. In view of the growing threat to Moscow, the party's Central Committee and the State Defense Committee decided to evacuate a number of Central Committee agencies, government offices, and the entire diplomatic corps to Kuibyshev, along with the most important state treasures. The evacuation began during the night of October 15th, 16. On the whole, Muscovites met these measures with complete understanding. However, as the saying goes, there are always black sheep in every family. In this case, cowards, panic-mongers and self-seekers began fleeing the capital in all directions, spreading panicky rumours about an inevitable surrender. To prevent further panic and to mobilize the troops and civilians of Moscow to repel the enemy, the State Defense Committee proclaimed a state of siege in Moscow and its surroundings on October 19. The defense line, Volokolamsk, Mozhaisk, Maloyaroslavets, Serpukhov, was still manned by weak forces and had been breached by the enemy in several places. To prevent an enemy breakthrough toward Moscow, the front's military council decided to establish a new defense line from Novozavidovsky through Klin, the Istra reservoir, the town of Istra, Zhavoronki, Krasnaya Pakhra, Serpukhov, and Alexin. Due to the importance of this decision, I want to quote in full the plan for the pullback of the armies of the Western Front from the Mozhaisk line. The plan, which was approved by Stalin on October 19th, contained the following provisions. 1. Pullback to new defense line. If the enemy offensive cannot be halted on the Mozhaisk line, the armies will pull back their main forces, especially their artillery, to a newly prepared defense line running through Novozavidovsky, Klin, Istra Reservoir, Istra, Zhavoronki, Krasnaya Pakhra, Serpukhov, and Alexin. Air support will be provided for this pullback. 2. Rearguard action. While positioning the armies on the new defense line, strong rear guards, saturated with anti-tank guns and mobile forces for brief counterattacks, will hold the enemy as long as possible along an intermediate line. 3. Army positioning. The armies will pull back within their present lateral boundaries, except for the 16th and 5th Armies, whose new boundary will run through Zagorsk, Iksha, Povarovo, and Tarkanovo. 4. Rear echelons. The rear echelons of the armies will be pulled back eastward, except for the 5th and 33rd Armies, whose rear echelons will have to bypass Moscow. Strict traffic controls will be required to prevent movement through the Moscow transport hub. This plan, and the sacrifice of those on the front lines, aimed to buy time for a more consolidated defence of Moscow, ensuring the survival of the capital and the possibility of countering the German assault. 5. In case the Fifth Army is unable to hold the main line running through Istra, Pavlovskaya Sloboda, and Zhavoronki, it should not be pulled back to the fortified ring around Moscow. Instead, it should retreat northeastward, north of Khimki, and on the left flank to the positions held by units of the 33rd Army south of Peredelkino and Lyubertsy. This will allow these units to be moved into the 5th Army Reserve, bypassing the Moscow fortified area on the southeast and east, and move to the area of Pushkino. 6. Accordingly, the 5th Army is to be based at the railroad station of Pushkino, while the 33rd Army will be based at Ramenskoye. The 16th, 43rd, and 49th Armies should be based at the supply stations within their respective boundaries. 7. To ensure the planned pullback, the road junctions at Novopetrovskoye, Kubinka, Narofominsk, and Voroby should be previously equipped with anti-tank defences to prevent enemy tanks from breaking through into the rear. Before the pullback, elements of the armies should occupy the key sectors of the new defence line with infantry units, especially artillery and signal corps detachments. In the 16th Army sector, the remainder of the 126th Rifle Division is to occupy the line in the area of Klin and Troitskoye. In the 5th Army sector, the 110th or the 113th Rifle Division should hold the area of Davidkovo and Krasnaya Pakhra. In the 43rd Army sector, the 53rd Rifle Division is to be stationed west of Podolsk and Lopasnya. 8. During the pullback, the Western Front Command will maintain contact with the various armies through the communications center of the People's Commissariat of Defense in Moscow, while a new communications center and front headquarters will be established in the area of Orakovo-Zuyevo or Likino-Dulevo. General Zhukov, commander of the Western Front; Bulganin, member, Western Front Military Council; Lieutenant General Sokolovsky, Western Front Chief of Staff, October 19, 1941. The plan was communicated on a top-secret basis to Army commanders, who then worked out their own plans accordingly. Although the pullback from the Mozhaisk line had been approved by the Supreme Command, troops of the Western Front withdrew with extremely heavy fighting in an attempt to hold up the enemy as long as possible, and gain time for the positioning of reinforcements from the Supreme Headquarters Reserve and for the strengthening of the defence line in the rear. In this grave hour of danger for our state, the life of each soldier belongs to the fatherland. The homeland demands from each one of you the greatest effort, courage, heroism, and steadfastness. The homeland calls on us to stand like an indestructible wall and bar the fascist hordes from our beloved Moscow. What we require now, as never before, are vigilance, iron discipline, organisation, determined action, unbending will for victory, and a readiness for self-sacrifice. I do not think it is necessary to retrace the course of military operations, which have been described in detail in many books and historical accounts. The outcome of the defensive operations of October is well known. During a month of bloody fighting, the German forces advanced a total of 145 to 160 miles. But Hitler's plan to seize Moscow was disrupted, the forces of the enemy were exhausted, and its shock units were overextended. Steadily losing strength, the German offensive was finally halted at the end of October along a line running through Turgenovo, Volokolamsk, Dorokovo, Narofominsk, west of Serpukhov and Alexin. By that time, troops of the Kalinin Front had stabilized the situation in the Kalinin area. Because of the great expanse of the Western Front and the problem of directing the forces around Kalinin, Supreme Headquarters decided on October 17th to combine the 22nd, 29th and 30th Armies into a new Kalinin Front, with General Konev in command, Corps Commissar D.S. Leonov as a member of the Military Council, and Major General II Ivanov as Chief of Staff. The Bryansk Front, which by October 30th had pulled back its forces to a line running through Alexin, Tula, Yefremov and Tim, had frustrated the enemy's plans to seize Tula and advance toward Yelets and Voronezh. The names of all the heroes who distinguished themselves in defense of the capital in October 1941 could not possibly be listed. Not only individual soldiers, but entire units won military glory by their feats in the name of the homeland. Such units could be found in any sector of the front. In the Volokolamsk sector, fortification troops put up a tenacious defence, with particular distinction won by the 316th Rifle Division under Major General IV Panfilov, which was subsequently transformed into the 8th Guards Division. It was also in this sector that a military school regiment under Colonel S.I. Mladentsev fought heroically with the support of 3 anti-tank artillery regiments. Unparalleled bravery was displayed by Emnya Yerokatukov's armoured brigade, which had been incorporated into the 16th Army. For its heroic fighting in October at Orel and Mtsensk, this unit, then called the 4th Tank Brigade, was honoured by being renamed the 1st Guards Tank Brigade, and its commander was awarded the Order of Lenin and the rank of Major General of Armoured Forces. In November, these tank men enhanced their reputation with new exploits. During 5 days of defensive fighting in the Volokolamsk sector, they ambushed and destroyed more than 30 enemy tanks. One of the best units in the Mozhaisk sector was the 32nd Rifle Division under Colonel Polosokin. Almost 130 years after Napoleon's campaign, this division once again fought an enemy on the field of Borodino, the sacred national battlefield that has become an immortal monument to Russian military glory. The division did nothing to lessen that glory, but rather brightened it. On the approaches to Maloyaroslavets, a heroic struggle was put up by the 312th Rifle Division and by cadets of the Podolsk infantry and artillery schools. The area of Midin was defended to the death by the tank men of Colonel Troitsky, whom I mentioned earlier. Around the ancient town of Borovsk, soldiers and officers of the 110th Rifle Division and the 151st Motorized Rifle Brigade added glory to their banners. Men of the 127th Tank Battalion stood shoulder to shoulder with them in repulsing the enemy. Brilliant episodes in the chronicle of those hard days were recorded by the heroic defenders of the city of Tula. Unfortunately, this aspect of the defence has not yet been adequately covered in the Soviet histories of the war. Yet it would be difficult to exaggerate the role that the defence of Tula played in the battle for Moscow.